Hello and welcome to part 3 of the Burda 6 2023 dress number 103. Sew along. So we'd left off having traced off the pattern pieces, of which for me when I trace the pattern pieces, I don't add the seam allowances at the tracing stage, which I've found works a lot better in case I need to make any adjustments or to get a really good idea of where the waistline falls against me, because I can just place the pattern piece against myself and the stitch line is the one that you can see, versus when you add the seam allowances, you then have to mentally subtract the seam allowances from the waist and from the shoulder point. So it's one of the reasons why I forced myself to learn how to add seam allowances at the cutting stage. So moving on, after explaining why my pattern pieces may seem smaller to yours if you're following along with this. And by the way, just a quick note, I would suggest that you watch through the video before you then start on it, because some of the things, they won't make sense until they make sense, because I'm quite obsessed with efficiency and getting things done as quickly as is possible. So the way that I tend to approach my sewing is in that way. So it might not make sense because most sewing patterns, they tend to do things on a modular basis, but I don't do it that way. So anyway, back to the video at hand. I have my fabric there, which is this lovely linen viscose. I have it folded over and I'm using my quilting ruler to make sure that everything is lined up on the grain. And then I'm pinning the pattern pieces onto the fabric. Normally I don't do this, the pinning that is. I normally would just cut it out and just fold it under. But because 3 of the pattern pieces are very similar, I need to make sure that I keep the fabric and the pattern pieces together. Another thing I always like to do is maybe every 4 projects or so, I have to sharpen my scissors. I've had these Fiskars for 12 years now, and how I keep them sharp is by using the sharpener, which is a great way to save, so you don't necessarily have to buy a new pair of dressmaking shears. So then I get into cutting. Now, I know that there's a preference sometimes for rotary cutters. I have tried rotary cutters and using a cutting mat, but it just didn't work for me. And I know that for some people that is more precise, but I've never been able to crack that particular skill set. So I prefer to do my cutting on the floor. And as you can see there, I am eyeballing my seam allowance. And again, this took a while to learn, but ultimately it was so worth it. It means that I can be very flexible with the seam allowances each time I cut. Another thing that I always make sure to do, anything that is on the fold, I will notch the center fold where it is, because when it comes to lining up the pattern pieces, always the center fold is very important. So I will always notch that no matter what it is I'm actually sewing. As you can see here, these 3 pattern pieces are relatively quite similar, and it could be easy to get lost and lose track of which seams you're supposed to be attaching. They are so similar, in fact, that when I was tracing the pattern pieces out, I accidentally traced the wrong pattern piece, and that's why the middle one has got some scribbled out lines on there. So very important to keep these together. I have fallen foul of this in the past, particularly with bodice pattern pieces that have the princess seam lines, because you end up having a couple of pattern pieces that look very similar. My preferred seam allowances to work with is a 1/2 inch, which is just a little bit over 1 centimeter. And I found that I'm very effective at being able to cut out with a 1/2 inch seam allowance very, very correctly. If I am really low on fabric, if my fabric is quite tight, I can go down to 3/8 of an inch or sometimes 1/4 of an inch, but that's only if the fabric is stable. So this pattern piece that I'm cutting out right now, that is the back, and I've given a little bit extra on where the zipper is going to go, because that will allow me to make any adjustments if I need to, because sometimes if the back, in lieu of having a sway back adjustment, you can just take the zipper in a little bit and contour it to your back if there is a bit of sway back paddling on there. So I will have about 5/8 of an inch rather than the 1/2 an inch on the zipper, where the zipper is going to go down for the bodice. Once the bodice pattern pieces have been cut out, the next thing to do is to work on the skirt pattern pieces. So in order to save myself the baking parchment, I just measured out the rectangular dimensions and I've written them down. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mark those on the fabric, because it is just a rectangular piece of fabric. So there's no need to trace it out, in my opinion. So using my awesome quilting ruler, which is a really wonderful sewing room tool, I just measure out. The dimensions that I measured did not include the seam allowances, so I had to add an inch to them. So where it was 14.5 inches, I would measure out 15.5, because it's 1/2 inch seam allowance either side. And so I'm using some tailor's chalk on the linen viscose. Normally I would use a friction pen, which the ink disappears when heat is applied to it. However, mine have run out and I basically need to reorder them. But the tailor's chalk works just fine. So I'm using the selvage edge for the back pattern pieces, for the skirt back pattern pieces, and you can see on there the light marking that I have showing where I'm going to have to cut it out. So just to recap, right, for the back, because there's a zipper on the back, the skirt pieces at the back actually are 2, and then the one at the front is the one that's cut on the fold. So I have across one panel, selvage edge is going to be cut into the back pattern pieces, and then the folded side is going to be the front skirt. And I was quite lucky that this fabric is wide enough that I was able to get these 3 pattern pieces off of just one fold of the fabric. So to recap, on the fold I've got the front skirt pattern piece, and then along the selvage I've got the 2 back skirt pattern pieces. So it meant that I could just do one cut straight across the entire grain, and then just one cut up the selvage. And as usual, I notch all of my center folds. Wherever there's a folded pattern piece, I will notch and mark where the center is, because we have to know where they are. It just makes life so much easier. So that's the top half of the skirt. The bottom half of the skirt, because there's no zipper there, it's just 2 pattern pieces that are cut on the fold. So I just measured those out, remembering to add in my 1 inch in total seam allowance, so 1/2 an inch for either side, and then I just cut those out. Normally I would have folded the fabric over itself so that I could cut the 2 pattern pieces together, but I didn't have enough space on the floor. I was a bit tight on the floor space. So what I did was I cut out the first pattern piece, shuffled the fabric along, made sure that everything was lined up on the straight grain, and then I just took the first pattern piece that I had cut out, laid it over the piece of fabric and lined it up, and then just cut around it, which just meant that I didn't have to do the whole thing with measuring out and using my tailor's chalk to mark exactly where I'm going to get it done. There's also something really very satisfying about cutting out rectangular pieces of fabric. It's so much easier when you don't have to be cutting around curves. So I do find that to be quite satisfying. And again, I added the seam allowance to this before I cut it out. And so there we've got the bottom skirt pattern pieces, and I'm notching the center folds. So one of the things that I'm doing, an alteration that I'm doing to this pattern, is I'm adding pockets, because it does have a gathered skirt, and so there's no reason why the pocket would interfere with the design lines. And I have a standard pocket template that I made that fits my hand so that my hands can have somewhere to hang out in. And I'm just going to use this bit of the leftover fabric to cut out 4 of the pocket pattern pieces. I really do love pockets on a sundress, and the only time that I wouldn't put pockets onto a dress or a skirt is when the pockets interfere with the design line. So here, my sweet spot is about 2.5 inches from the waistline. That's where my pocket always goes. And that's something that I've just learned over the years from adding pockets and from doing pockets in just about everything that I sew. So I just take the skirt pattern pieces, the top skirt pattern pieces, and I'm just going to notch on them where I've measured 2.5 inches below, and it will come up to a total of 2 3/4 of an inch, because the pocket pattern piece has got a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So everything has been cut out now, so I can put the rest of the fabric away. And now the next stage is to prepare for sewing. We're not going to sew just yet because we have those curved seams that are just a little bit unstable, and we need to stabilize them. So one of the ways that you can do that is by stay stitching, but I prefer to use this tape, which is a stay stitching tape, and it's basically got a line of stitching on a tiny strip of bias cut interfacing, and you just press it on. It's like a fusible interfacing with a line of stitching. It's basically like you're cheating with stay stitching. Takes a while to get used to it, but once you crack it, it's a really useful thing to have. And I find that for me personally, it creates a neater result than if I were to use stay stitching. And that's because I can be less precise. Yes, I know that if I'm aiming to be an advanced seamstress, I need to work on precision, but if I can get away with some lovely little cheats, I will, in the pursuit of being able to make more of what I love. But as you can see on there, I'm basically holding the tape along, and I'm using a hot iron to fuse it to the fabric, and that will stop that curve from stretching out whilst being handled and whilst being sewn. And as you can see, once you've let it cool down, I haven't let it condition, so I have to do this and then leave it for about 15 to 20 minutes is normally enough in order for it to condition, cool down, and then it will be ready for sewing. So all of the curved edges on these pattern pieces are going to get the treatment of the fusible stay stitching. It gives it a lot more stability, and it means that the finish is nicer and crisper, I think, than when you use stay stitching on the sewing machine. But just try it out, because once I tried it out, I felt so confident in using the fusible stay tape that I ended up buying a big roll of it rather than the smaller 2-3 meter rolls that you could get before. So I have loads of it, because every time that I sew, particularly anything that's sleeveless or anything that's got a curved neckline, this is my go-to treatment in order to make sure that I get a nice crisp edge on there. normally I would remove the pattern pieces, but in this case you can see I'm putting on the stay tape and I'm not separating them out. And that's again because of how similar some of the pattern pieces are and how some of the seams are very specifically designed to connect to. So seam number 2 is supposed to connect to seam number 2. And I found in the past that with princess seam lines, I can easily run a fall of that. Particularly when I get into the groove and I'm just sewing, and then I'll end up realizing that I've sewn the wrong pattern piece, or I've sewn it counterintuitively and it doesn't work well. So I find that when I'm doing anything that has princess seam lines, those pattern pieces that indicate which seams are going to be buttoned up next to each other, they stay on right up until I pin the pattern pieces together. Otherwise, I have gotten confused in the past before. So this might seem very excessive, but it is absolutely necessary based on past experiences. And I do like to be efficient. The only pattern piece that I can confidently do this with is the front one, because it's very clear which one is the bodice front. It's got that lovely scoop neckline that I can't wait to try. I'm so excited about that neckline. So that gets a nice dose of stabilization over there. And when you turn it over and you see the fashion side of the fabric where it's been stabilized with this stay tape, it looks really nice. And once you sew it up, it will be nice and popping and stable, and there won't be any unsightly gaping. It really is lovely. So we need to leave these to condition, that is to cool down fully on a nice flat place. And in the meantime, we're going to be preparing the pockets. My philosophy towards sewing is basically similar to the French cooking theory of mise en place, which means that get everything together, measured out, and then you just do it, the sewing in one go. So with the pockets, I am overlocking all around the pocket edges, and that is just going to make life a lot easier for me in terms of finishing this dress. This is just what I've picked up from the Giselle maxi dress, which is sort of similar in style to this, and I've made the Giselle maxi dress about 8 times, and this is the process by which I found that I can make it super quickly. I just overlock those pocket edges, and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense now, but it makes everything flow so much faster once we get to the sewing stage. The principle of mise en place in sewing for me basically means that I try and gather all of the ingredients, in this case all of the pattern pieces. They're all ready and prepared before I actually start sewing. So the other thing that I'm also going to be preparing is the skirt pattern pieces by overlocking them as well. So I found that it's a lot better for me to do the overlocking, especially when I'm using the selvage edge for the zippers, which is something that I always do wherever possible. If I've got a skirt or the skirt section of a dress that is has got a zipper either on the center front or on the side, I will always try and line up those pattern pieces so that it's on the selvage, so I don't have to worry about finishing the edge, overlocking the edge where the zipper is going to go. So as you can see on there, I've got the pattern pieces and the pockets. You have zipper on one side and the pockets on the other side, and that's where the pocket is going to go. So since one side is already finished for me, being that it is the selvage edge, I'm just going to overlock the other ends, as well as for the skirt front, the upper skirt front, as well as the skirt bottom pieces. So I'm just going to overlock those side seams. And for overlocking, I'm just going to use a technique that I saw on industrial sewing channels, which they call butting. So instead of overlocking, stopping, cutting the overlock trail, all the sides that just need to be overlocked, I just push them through the overlocker, and then I will sort of cut them apart at the end. And I love this technique. Number one, it saves on thread tails. I no longer have as many thread tails on my sewing room floor as I used to before. And so in that regards, it's pretty useful. And then it saves on time. It just makes everything so much faster. And so as you can see, I just push them through. And then once I've finished all of them, it's just a simple matter of going into snip, and the pattern pieces are ready and done. And we'll stop here for now. So this is the mise en place for this particular project. Everything is prepped and everything is ready to go. And I'll see you in the next video where we'll start sewing. Until next time, happy sewing. Bye.